So yesterday we talked about combining supply and demand. That's what the bell ringer was about, which we typed into Canvas chat, and then the antitrust activity. Hopefully you were able to start that at least, maybe finish it, where you had to either choose if one of the scenarios the businesses were breaking the law or if they were just a natural type of monopoly. And then you just had to highlight an explanation in the description. So the notes for today will be about market structure. And market structure takes four variables into consideration. And there are four different types of market structure that exist. So the variables that it takes into consideration are number of firms, the variety of goods, barriers to entry, and control over prices. The first of the market structure we'll talk about is perfect competition. Now, remember in economics, we use simplifications, and there really no such thing is no such thing as perfect competition, but there are industries that get really close to it. But in the case of perfect competition, there are many firms. So there's thousands and thousands of businesses involved in a perfectly competitive marketplace. The variety of goods is there is none. They make identical products, or at least virtually identical, indistinguishable to the consumer. The barrier to entry for a perfectly competitive market is that there is none. It's relatively easy to start a business in a perfectly competitive marketplace, at least compared to the other ones. And they have no control over market prices. They simply have to go with whatever supply and demand dictate. If they raise them even just a little tiny bit by a few cents, no one will buy from them because there's many other producers that sell it for less. And they can't drop their prices either because then they won't be able to pay for their costs. So an example of perfectly competitive marketplaces, most agriculture or farms, and buying and selling of stocks would also be an example. Stock is stock. It's a share of a company. Farms, one cherry tomato farmer is the same virtually as another cherry tomato farmer. When you think about that, especially in relationship to farming, there are many farmers. They make identical products virtually.
They even have their own dating site.
They do, yes, thank you. And it is still difficult to start any type of business, but compared to other ones, usually it's a sole proprietorship or partnership or small family-owned business. So it is one of the easier ones to begin. And they don't really have a lot of control over prices because, like I said, if they ask a little bit more money for their cherry tomatoes, no one's going to buy them. The next type of market structure is at the opposite end of the spectrum, and that would be a monopoly. A monopoly, obviously, the number of firms is one, hence the prefix mono. And they obviously make a unique good. No one else produces that particular item. As for barriers to entry, it is difficult to start and hold on to. Really, the only way you can create one is by buying up a lot of other businesses or creating a new product that nobody else has. Those are not easy tasks. And then holding on to it is difficult because eventually a competitor is going to come along.
Oh, okay. Apparently I just dropped from 40% to 4%. That's fun.
Oh, your battery.
Keep going. I got 13 minutes left. Let's keep going.
Full control over prices. Because obviously they're the only ones. They can say exactly what the price should be. However, just like there's no such thing as truly perfect competition, there's really no such thing as an actual monopoly in a marketplace. Really, the only one that controls a monopoly would be the government, for instance. So, for example, city sewage, that is an example of monopoly. In real life, many of the companies that get accused of being monopolies are not. Walmart is not a monopoly. Amazon is not a monopoly. Microsoft was not a monopoly.
Heck, yo, we don't have to buy from Amazon. We can buy from Wish. You remember Wish, don't you? No.
Monopolistic competition is the next one. And it is in between perfectly competitive marketplace and a monopoly. So, like a perfectly competitive marketplace, there are many producers. But they do not make identical products, they make similar ones that can be easily substituted for each other. There are few barriers to entry. They just have to think, how do I make the same product but make it a little bit different? So there are few barriers to entry. And because they have their own version of this product that they might be able to convince people is better or design some type of loyalty out of buying this particular product, it means they do have some control over prices. An example of a monopolistically competitive industry would be selling clothing or people that cut hair. There are lots of clothing companies and stores. There are lots of people that cut hair. They each have their own little version. In the case of places that cut hair, it's really about the personal relationship and how they market themselves, because really there's not a lot of difference. But it depends upon the individual and how they treat their customers that they can get loyalty out of them. The last one is called an oligopoly. And anytime OLI is used, whether it's oligopoly or oligarchy, it means few. And so there are few firms in an oligopoly. Just like monopolistically competitive marketplaces, they make similar products that are substitutes. The only difference is these are complex products or high-end, expensive to produce. So the barriers to entry are many. It's expensive to get into an industry that is an oligopoly. That's why there's few businesses to begin with. And just like the monopolistically competitive marketplace, they do have some control over prices. They sell a similar product, but they have a little bit different version. So they might be able to convince some people to pay a little bit more money. An example of an oligopoly would be the automobile industry. There's only 3 big manufacturers in the United States. They make similar products, even though people on social media like to taunt each other about which version they drive. They really aren't that much different. But they've convinced people they are. So you build in that brand loyalty and you can charge more for your Ford or your Chevy or whatever because people actually think that there's a huge difference. And then another example would be cereal manufacturers. There's only so many of those in the United States, Kellogg's, Post, Quaker, and so on. And same thing, they have to have massive factories and distribution networks, so it's expensive to get into, and they do the same thing. They build loyalty for carbs coated with sugar and convince people it's worth paying for. So we already looked at all this here. The last thing I want to mention is that in the case of monopolies and oligopolies, Monopolies are virtually banned by the antitrust laws, but there are natural monopolies that still exist. And this is also in that sheet, so you don't have to type it again if you want to. But geographic, for instance, the last gas station for miles. Governmental, an example would be the only cable company allowed in town, or it could be government controlled, like the police force. And then technological would be patents for new products. And then some of the antitrust laws also apply to oligopolies, because if you only have two companies and they work together, basically it's the same thing as a monopoly. So oligopolistic companies are forbidden from cooperating with each other. So for the remainder of the period, the reading, or you can finish the antitrust activity. These are the end of the notes, so you can add your comments and summary down at the bottom and submit them. And tomorrow, of course, we have the quizzes to complete. And then if you have some time, you can work on the quarter 4 finance assignment, which counts as a test grade due on May 31st.